They thought she died in the massacre, but a Navajo warrior found her alive under a cottonwood. The arrow sliced through Kate Morgan's shoulder as she ran. She stumbled but kept moving, blood soaking through her shirt. Behind her, the screams had stopped. The whole wagon train was silent now except for the crackling of flames. She had watched her husband fall, watched the others try to fight back. Now she was alone in the chaos, running toward the cottonwood trees by the dry creek bed. Another arrow whistled past her head. Kate's legs burned as she pushed herself harder, her vision blurring from pain and tears. The cottonwood grove was close now, maybe 50 yards. She could hear horses behind her, the war cries getting louder. Her boot caught on a rock and she went down hard, rolling through the dirt and sagebrush. When she looked up, a warrior on horseback was bearing down on her, raising his lance. Kate scrambled backward on her hands, her injured shoulder screaming in protest. The rider was almost on top of her when a gunshot cracked through the air. The warrior jerked and fell from his horse. Kate didn't wait to see where the shot came from. She forced herself up and ran the last 20 yards to the cottonwoods, diving into the tangled roots of the largest tree. She pressed herself into a hollow at the base of the trunk, pulling dead branches over her body. The sounds of battle raged for another hour. Kate heard riders passing close by, heard them calling to each other. She stayed frozen in her hiding spot, barely breathing, her hand pressed against her bleeding shoulder. The arrow had gone clean through, and she could feel the shaft pressing against the tree bark behind her. Every movement sent fresh waves of pain through her body. Eventually the sounds faded. She heard the raiders riding away, their voices growing distant. Then silence fell over the prairie, broken only by the wind and the cottonwood leaves and the occasional pop of burning wood from the destroyed wagons. Kate waited until full dark before she dared to move. When she finally crawled out from under the branches, her whole body was stiff and cold. Blood had soaked her entire left side. She made her way back toward the wagons on shaking legs. The moon was rising, casting silver light over the scene of destruction. Bodies lay scattered across the ground. The wagons were reduced to blackened frames, still smoking. Kate searched through the wreckage with numb determination, looking for supplies, for weapons, for any sign of life. She found nothing but death. Everyone she had traveled with for the past 4 months was gone. She was alone on the empty prairie with a bad wound and no supplies. Kate stumbled back toward the cottonwoods as dawn broke. She needed water, needed to tend her wound before infection set in. The creek bed was dry, just as she feared, but she knew there might be water if she dug down. She used a flat rock to scrape at the sandy bottom, working one-handed while her injured arm hung useless at her side. After 20 minutes, water began to seep into the hole. She waited for it to pool, then drank greedily, the cool liquid bringing brief relief. She washed her wound as best she could, biting down on a stick to keep from screaming as she pulled the arrow shaft through. The bleeding started fresh, but she packed the holes with mud and strips torn from her skirt. It would have to do. Kate leaned back against the cottonwood trunk, exhausted and feverish. The morning sun climbed higher, beating down on the destroyed camp. Vultures were already circling overhead. Sleep came in fitful waves. Kate would drift off, then wake with a start at imagined sounds. Her fever climbed as the day wore on. She crawled to the waterhole several times, drinking and wetting her face, but the infection was setting in fast. By afternoon, she was delirious, barely aware of her surroundings. She thought she heard horses again and tried to hide, but her body wouldn't respond. She lay in the shade of the cottonwood, waiting for death to claim her like it had claimed everyone else. The sun was setting when the Navajo warrior found her. His name was Little Wolf, though Kate didn't know that yet. He had been tracking the raiders who attacked the wagon train, following at a careful distance. He wasn't part of that war party. His people were far from here, and he was on a different mission entirely. But when he saw the smoke and investigated, he found the massacre. Now he was checking for survivors, not expecting to find any. Little Wolf approached the cottonwood grove carefully, his rifle ready. He had seen the tracks leading here, seen where someone had dug for water. When he spotted Kate lying motionless in the shadows, he thought at first she was already dead. Then he saw her chest rise with a shallow breath. He knelt beside her, noting the crude bandages, the fever flush on her pale face. The wound was bad and getting worse. He made a quick decision. Little Wolf couldn't leave her here to die. He gathered her up gently, and Kate's eyes fluttered open briefly. She saw his face above her, saw the long black hair and dark eyes, and fear shot through her fever haze. She tried to struggle, but she was too weak. Little Wolf spoke softly in his own language. Words she couldn't understand, but the tone was reassuring. He carried her to his horse, a sturdy pinto that stood patiently nearby. Kate faded in and out of consciousness as they rode. She was vaguely aware of movement, of strong arms holding her steady in the saddle. Little Wolf rode through the night, heading toward a place he knew about, a small canyon with a spring and shelter. He needed to get her somewhere safe where he could treat her wound properly. The fever was dangerous, but the infection was worse. They reached the canyon just before dawn. Little Wolf laid Kate down on a bed of grass near the spring. He built a small fire and heated water, then set about cleaning her wound properly. He had learned healing from his grandmother, knew which plants to use for infection and fever. Kate woke fully as he worked on her shoulder, and this time she was coherent enough to be terrified. She tried to pull away, tried to fight him, but Little Wolf held her firmly and continued his work. He spoke to her again in Navajo, his voice calm and steady, and gradually she stopped struggling. Maybe it was the fever, or maybe she simply had no strength left to resist. Little Wolf worked through the morning, treating the wound with poultices made from plants he gathered near the spring. He gave her water mixed with herbs to fight the fever. Kate drifted between sleep and waking, each time surprised to find herself still alive, surprised to find this warrior who should have been her enemy instead saving her life. By afternoon, the fever began to break. Her shoulder still hurt terribly, but the burning sensation of infection was easing. She watched Little Wolf move around the camp, efficient and purposeful, and wondered what would happen next. Little Wolf knew he had a problem. He couldn't take Kate with him on his mission, but he couldn't leave her alone either. She was too weak, too injured. The nearest settlement was weeks away, and she would never make it on her own. He sat by the fire that evening, thinking through his options while Kate slept fitfully nearby. She would live. He was fairly certain of that now. The wound was clean and the fever was dropping. But her recovery would take time, and time was something he didn't have much of. When Kate woke in the morning, she found food waiting for her. Roasted rabbit and some kind of flatbread. She ate slowly, watching Little Wolf across the fire. He was young, she realized, probably not much older than her own 25 years. His face was serious, but not cruel. She tried to speak, to ask him questions, but he just shook his head. They had no common language. Kate pointed to herself and said her name clearly. Little Wolf tilted his head, then pointed to himself and said his name. It was a start. Over the next 3 days, they developed a basic way of communicating through gestures and simple words. Little Wolf taught her some Navajo words, and she taught him some English. Kate's shoulder was healing well under his care. She could move her arm now without too much pain, though it was still weak. Little Wolf had checked her bandages every day, changing the poultices, making sure no infection returned. Kate found herself grateful beyond measure and also deeply confused. Everything she had been told about Indians said they were savages, killers. But this man had shown her nothing but kindness. On the 4th day, Little Wolf made preparations to leave. He packed his supplies and saddled his horse. Kate felt panic rising in her chest. Where was he going? Was he leaving her here alone? She tried to ask, tried to make him understand her fear. Little Wolf seemed to debate with himself for a long moment. Then he gestured for her to come with him. He had made his decision. He couldn't leave her, and he couldn't stay. So she would have to come along on his journey. They rode together on the Pinto, Kate sitting in front while Little Wolf guided the horse. He traveled cautiously, keeping to cover, watching the horizon constantly. Kate gradually understood they were avoiding something or someone. Little Wolf was on edge, his body tense, his eyes always scanning. Whatever mission he was on, it was dangerous. Kate wanted to ask, wanted to know what she had gotten herself into, but their limited shared vocabulary wasn't enough for complex explanations. They traveled for 2 weeks like this. Little Wolf hunted along the way, and they camped in hidden spots each night. Kate's strength slowly returned. Her shoulder was healing into an angry scar, but she could use her arm again. She helped with camp tasks, gathering firewood, preparing food. Little Wolf seemed surprised at first by her willingness to work, but he accepted her help. A strange companionship developed between them, built on necessity but growing into something like trust. Kate learned more Navajo words, and Little Wolf picked up more English. They could have basic conversations now, though misunderstandings were frequent. Kate learned that Little Wolf was tracking a man, a white trader who had sold rifles to enemies of his people. The trader was heading to Santa Fe, and Little Wolf meant to stop him. It was a personal mission, Kate gathered, tied to some wrong that had been done to Little Wolf's family. She didn't push for details. She had her own grief to carry. On the 15th day of their journey, they spotted dust on the horizon. Little Wolf immediately changed course, heading for a cluster of rocks that would provide cover. They watched from hiding as a group of riders passed in the distance. White men, well armed, moving fast. Kate felt Little Wolf tense beside her. After the riders were gone, he seemed troubled. He spoke rapidly in Navajo, and Kate caught only a few words. Soldiers, searching, danger. That night, Little Wolf drew a map in the dirt by the firelight. He showed Kate where they were, where Santa Fe lay to the south and where the nearest settlement was to the east. He pointed to the settlement and then to Kate, then to himself and Santa Fe. Kate shook her head vigorously. She understood what he was suggesting. He wanted to leave her at the settlement, let her go back to her own people. But Kate had no people left. Everyone she knew was dead back at that wagon train. And somehow over these past weeks she had come to trust this quiet warrior more than she trusted the world that had produced the men who massacred her friends. She pointed to Little Wolf, then to herself, then to Santa Fe, together. Little Wolf studied her face for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. They would continue together. Kate didn't fully understand why she wanted to stay with him. Part of it was practical. Alone, she would be vulnerable. But there was more to it than that. Little Wolf had saved her life and asked nothing in return. He had shown her respect and kindness. In this harsh land, that meant something. They reached the outskirts of Santa Fe 3 days later. It was the biggest town Kate had ever seen. Adobe buildings clustered together, smoke rising from chimneys, the sound of church bells and commerce filling the air. Little Wolf found a camp in the hills overlooking the town. He spent the next day watching the streets below through his rifle scope, searching for his quarry. Kate stayed at the camp uneasy about being so close to civilization again. She had changed over the past weeks. The woman who had fled from the wagon train massacre seemed like someone else entirely. Little Wolf came back that evening with news. He had spotted the trader, a fat man with red hair who was staying at a cantina on the edge of town. The man had guards with him, 3 rough-looking characters who never left his side. Little Wolf's face was grim as he explained this to Kate, mixing Navajo, English, and gestures to get his meaning across. Getting to the trader would be difficult, dangerous. Kate surprised herself by asking how she could help. Little Wolf looked at her sharply, as if trying to determine if she was serious. Kate held his gaze. She was serious. This man had saved her life. If she could help him complete his mission, she would. Little Wolf considered for a moment, then began to lay out a plan. Kate spoke English fluently. She could get close to the trader in ways Little Wolf never could. She could scout the cantina, figure out the guards' patterns, maybe even create a distraction when the time came. The next morning, Kate walked into Santa Fe wearing clothes Little Wolf had stolen from a clothesline the night before. She had washed her face and tied back her hair. Her shoulder still ached, and the scar was visible at her collar, but she looked presentable enough. She made her way to the cantina, her heart pounding. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and the smell of cheap whiskey. She spotted the red-haired trader immediately. He sat at a corner table playing cards with his guards. Kate bought a drink and found a seat where she could watch without being obvious. She spent 2 hours there nursing the same glass of whiskey, observing. The guards were professionals, she could tell. They watched the room constantly, hands never far from their guns. The trader was loud and crude, bragging about deals he had made, about the profits he was earning. Kate felt disgust rising in her throat as she listened to him talk about selling weapons to different tribes, playing them against each other for his own profit. She returned to camp with detailed information. The guards changed shifts at midnight. For about 10 minutes, the trader was alone while the old guards left and new ones arrived. It wasn't much, but it was a window. Little Wolf listened intently, then outlined his plan. It was risky, but it could work. Kate would create a distraction outside the cantina at midnight, drawing away whoever was nearby. Little Wolf would slip in through the back and confront the trader during the guard change. They prepared through the afternoon. Little Wolf checked his weapons, sharpened his knife. Kate practiced the story she would tell, the distraction she would create. As the sun set, they moved into position. Kate was terrified, but she was also determined. She thought about the people from her wagon train, about the innocent lives destroyed by greed and violence. Maybe this wouldn't bring them back, but it felt like she was doing something that mattered. Midnight approached. Kate stood outside the cantina, watching the street. At exactly 12, she let out a scream and fell to the ground, clutching her leg. People came running, including one of the trader's guards. Kate sobbed that a snake had bitten her, that she needed help. The guard looked uncertain, torn between his duty and basic human decency. Other townspeople gathered around, adding to the confusion. Kate kept up her performance, drawing the crowd away from the cantina entrance. Inside, Little Wolf moved like a shadow, slipped through the back door just as the midnight guards were arriving at the front. The trader was alone at his table, counting his money. Little Wolf crossed the room silently and pressed his knife against the man's throat before he could shout for help. The trader's eyes went wide with terror. Little Wolf spoke in English, his accent heavy but his words clear. This was for the rifles sold to his enemies, for the deaths those weapons had caused. The trader tried to bargain, tried to offer money, but Little Wolf wasn't interested in negotiation. Outside, Kate heard shouts from inside the cantina. Her distraction had worked, but now things were happening fast. She jumped up, claiming she felt better, and melted into the crowd before anyone could stop her. She made her way quickly toward the meeting point she and Little Wolf had agreed upon, a stable 2 blocks away. Her heart was racing. Had he succeeded? Was he all right? Little Wolf emerged from the cantina moments later, moving fast but not running. He had left the trader tied and gagged, stripped of his weapons and money. Little Wolf had taken what he came for, a journal that detailed all the trader's dealings, proof that could be given to the territorial authorities. He hadn't killed the man, though the temptation had been strong. Instead, he had left him to face justice in the white man's courts. It was a risk, but Little Wolf hoped the evidence would be enough. They met at the stable and rode out immediately, not waiting to see what would happen. By the time the trader's guards found him and raised the alarm, Little Wolf and Kate were miles away, riding hard through the night. They didn't slow down until dawn, when they finally stopped at a hidden spring to water the horse and catch their breath. Kate was shaking from the adrenaline. Little Wolf seemed calm, but she could see the tension in his shoulders starting to ease. They had done it. Against all odds, they had completed the mission. Little Wolf gave the journal to a U.S. Marshal they encountered 2 days later, a man he had dealt with before who he trusted to be honest. The Marshal promised to investigate, promised that the traitor would face charges. It wasn't perfect justice, but it was something. Little Wolf seemed satisfied, or at least resigned. The personal vendetta that had driven him was settled, one way or another. Now they faced a different question. What happened next? Little Wolf turned to Kate as they made camp that evening and asked her directly in his improving English. Where did she want to go? What did she want to do? Kate had been thinking about this for days. She had no family left. No home. The life she had been heading toward with the wagon train was gone forever. But here with Little Wolf, she had found a different kind of life. A harder life, certainly, but also one where she felt more alive than she ever had before. She told him she wanted to stay with him, if he would let her. She could learn his language properly, learn his ways. She could be useful. Little Wolf was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire. Finally, he nodded. His people's camp was 3 weeks north. The journey would be dangerous, and Kate's reception there was uncertain. She was white, after all, and many of his people had been hurt by whites. But Little Wolf said he would vouch for her, would explain how she had helped him, how she had proven herself. The journey north was the hardest they had made yet. They crossed mountains and deserts, following paths that Kate would never have found on her own. Little Wolf taught her as they traveled how to read the land, how to find water, how to move quietly. Kate proved to be a quick learner. The soft woman who had fled from the wagon train massacre was gone. In her place was someone tougher, more capable, someone who could survive. They encountered other travelers along the way, traders, settlers, prospectors. Little Wolf kept them hidden most of the time, but twice they met people who seemed trustworthy. Kate heard news of the outside world. The trader from Santa Fe was indeed facing charges. The U.S. Marshal had arrested him, and several powerful people were implicated in his network. Little Wolf's gambit with the journal had worked better than expected. Justice was slow and imperfect, but it was happening. Kate also heard that search parties were looking for survivors from wagon train massacres in the territory. Her name was mentioned. People thought she was dead, killed with the others. Kate realized she had a choice to make. She could reveal herself, could go back to the white settlements and resume some version of her old life. Or she could stay dead, could continue on this path she had started down with Little Wolf. She chose to stay dead. When they passed near a trading post one afternoon, Kate slipped in alone and bought supplies with money Little Wolf had given her. The trader didn't recognize her, didn't connect this lean, sun-darkened woman with the Kate Morgan who was presumed dead. She bought ammunition, coffee, and a good knife. When she came back to where Little Wolf was waiting, she showed him the knife with a smile. She was committed now. There was no going back. 3 weeks after leaving Santa Fe, they approached Little Wolf's camp. It was located in a hidden valley, protected by steep cliffs on 3 sides. Smoke from cooking fires rose into the evening air. Dogs barked as they approached. People came out of their homes calling greetings to Little Wolf. Then they saw Kate, and the greetings turned to suspicious silence. Little Wolf raised his hand and called out, his voice carrying across the camp. He spoke rapidly in Navajo, too fast for Kate to follow. She caught her own name, heard him mention the wagon train and Santa Fe. An older woman came forward, her face lined with age and wisdom. She was Little Wolf's grandmother, the one who had taught him healing. She looked at Kate with sharp, evaluating eyes. Then she spoke, and Little Wolf translated. The grandmother wanted to see Kate's wound, wanted to verify Little Wolf's story about how he had saved her. Kate pulled aside her collar, showing the scar. The grandmother examined it closely, then nodded. She spoke again, and Little Wolf smiled for the first time since they had arrived. His grandmother said Kate could stay. She would teach Kate properly, would show her the right way to do things. The first months in the camp were difficult. Kate had to learn everything from scratch. The language, the customs, the daily routines. Some people in the camp were friendly, curious about this white woman who had come among them. Others were hostile, remembering their own losses at the hands of white settlers and soldiers. Kate bore their hostility with patience, knowing she had to earn acceptance through her actions, not her words. Little Wolf's grandmother became her teacher and protector. The old woman was strict but fair. She taught Kate how to cure hides, how to prepare food, how to gather the plants used for medicine and dye. Kate worked harder than she had ever worked in her life. Her hands became calloused, her skin darker from constant sun exposure. She learned to think in Navajo, to see the world through different eyes. It was like being reborn into a new life. Little Wolf was often away from camp, scouting or hunting. But when he was there, he continued to help Kate learn. Their friendship deepened into something more, though they were both cautious about it. The differences between them were real and significant. Kate knew that choosing to be with Little Wolf would mean fully committing to this life, giving up any last ties to her old world. It was a choice she wrestled with through the long winter months. Spring came to the valley, bringing new growth and warmer days. Kate had been with the camp for almost a year now. She spoke Navajo fluently, dressed like the other women, and had been accepted, if not by everyone, then by most. The grandmother told her she was ready to make her choice. Stay permanently and become one of the people, or leave and return to the white world. There would be no shame either way, the old woman said, but the choice had to be made. Kate knew her answer before the question was fully asked. This was her home now. These were her people. Having something here she had never known in her old life. Purpose, community, and love. Little Wolf had asked her to be his wife, and she had accepted. The marriage ceremony was simple but meaningful, conducted by the grandmother with the whole camp watching. Kate Morgan, the woman who had died under a cottonwood tree, was gone forever. In her place was someone new, someone stronger, someone who had found her place in the world. The years passed. Kate and Little Wolf built a life together in the Hidden Valley. They had children, 2 daughters who grew up strong and healthy. Kate taught them English alongside Navajo, wanting them to understand both worlds. The world outside the valley was changing rapidly. More settlers came every year, pushing into lands that had belonged to the tribes. Treaties were made and broken. Violence flared and died down, and flared again. Little Wolf continued his work, now acting as a mediator between his people and the encroaching white settlements. Kate's unique position, fluent in both languages and cultures, made her valuable in these negotiations. She traveled with Little Wolf to meetings with territorial officials, helping to bridge the gap between the two worlds. It wasn't always successful, and sometimes it felt like trying to hold back a flood with bare hands. But they kept trying, kept working for peace and understanding. The wagon train massacre was never far from Kate's mind. Sometimes she dreamed of that day, of the screams and the blood and the flames. But she also dreamed of the cottonwood tree, of Little Wolf finding her there and choosing to save rather than kill. That choice had changed everything, not just for her, but for everyone whose lives she had touched since. The woman they thought had died in the massacre had lived, and her survival had meant something. She had become a bridge between worlds, a voice for understanding in a time of terrible conflict. On quiet evenings, when the work was done and the children were asleep, Kate would sit with Little Wolf and watch the sunset over the valley. They would talk about the day, about their hopes and fears for the future. Little Wolf would sometimes ask if she regretted her choice, if she missed her old life. Kate would shake her head. The old life was gone, destroyed in fire and blood. But from those ashes, she had been reborn into something better. She had found a home, a family, a purpose. The woman who had hidden under a cottonwood tree, waiting to die, had instead found a reason to live, and that made all the difference.